CEO humiliates janitor in front of everyone, forcing her to clean his shoes. What happens next shocks everyone. Subscribe and comment where you're watching this video from. The city stretched high into the sky, its glass and steel towers reflecting the fading glow of the afternoon sun. Inside one of these towering structures, a corporate machine hummed along with precise, unbroken rhythm. Phones rang, keyboards clattered, and hurried footsteps echoed against the polished marble floors. In this world of numbers and transactions, where ambition overshadowed humanity, everyone had their place. The ambitious climbed, the weak endured, and those who were neither simply vanished into the background. Victoria was one of them, the invisible ones. She had arrived just a few days ago, stepping into the pristine lobby without drawing a single glance. A dark-skinned woman of quiet demeanor, she carried herself with an air of self-containment, as if she neither expected nor required acknowledgement. Her uniform was crisp, her posture upright, her hands steady as she pushed her cleaning cart down the corridors of glass-walled offices, where men and women in suits barely noticed her existence. It was not that they were cruel, nor did they hold any particular malice toward her. It was simply that they had long since learned to filter out what did not concern them. The coffee machines, the cleaning staff, the silent movements of the janitors at the edge of their vision, these were all just background noise in their relentless pursuit of deadlines and promotions. Victoria did not mind. She moved with quiet efficiency, wiping down desks without disturbing a single misplaced document, sweeping away footprints without disrupting the frantic energy of the office. She had an unspoken grace, a patience that felt deliberate, as though she was more than just a silent worker, but an observer of a world that did not see her. No one asked about her past, and she offered no stories. There was no idle chatter with the receptionists, no friendships formed in the break room. She did not linger near gossiping employees or hesitate when given a task. Every movement was precise, purposeful. She was simply there, doing what was expected, and then disappearing before anyone even thought to thank her. The few who did notice her presence saw nothing remarkable. A middle-aged woman, neat but unassuming, her features composed, her expressions unreadable. Some assumed she was simply grateful for the job, one of the countless faceless employees who came and went without a trace. Others, if they ever thought of her at all, dismissed her as yet another worker in the hierarchy that placed them above people like her. But Victoria was watching. She saw the way the office functioned, the way certain employees held their shoulders higher than others, the way power flowed in unseen currents beneath every exchange. She took note of who spoke first in meetings, who averted their eyes when their ideas were dismissed, who carried the burden of extra work while others took the credit. She noticed the way people spoke when they thought no one was listening, and above all, she noticed him. At the top of this intricate ecosystem stood Richard Stanton. He did not rush through the office like his subordinates. He strode, each step deliberate, each glance weighted with the knowledge that he was the center of gravity in every room he entered. People fell silent when he passed, shifting awkwardly in their seats, suddenly hyper-aware of the unfinished work on their screens. He was a man who commanded respect not through kindness, but through the quiet understanding that his word was absolute. His suit was always perfect. His shoes gleamed without a single scuff. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. A simple look, a slightly arched brow, was enough to reduce a junior executive to nervous stammering. Victoria had seen men like him before. She watched from the edges of the room as he moved through his domain, basking in the silent reverence of those around him. He was not the kind of man who asked for things. He expected them to be done before he had to speak. He did not acknowledge those beneath him unless it was to remind them of their place. And that, she knew, was exactly what he was about to do to her. It was inevitable. Men like Richard Stanton always found their way to people like her. Not because they needed to, but because they wanted to. Because power was not satisfying unless it was seen, unless it was felt, unless it was imposed upon those who could not fight back. Victoria was patient. She was quiet. She knew how to wait, but she was not weak. Richard Stanton did not simply occupy space. He dominated it. He moved through the halls of the corporate headquarters with the effortless confidence of a man who knew he was untouchable. Every step he took was measured, every glance calculated, every pause in his stride deliberate. He had built his kingdom not through kindness or wisdom, but through sheer force of presence. And presence, he had learned early in his career, was far more powerful than competence. There were men who built their legacies on ideas, on innovation, on the quiet pursuit of something greater than themselves. Stanton was not one of them. He thrived on control, on the weight of expectation, on the silent knowledge that he could make or break careers with a single word. He had no patience for weakness, no interest in charity. He valued only two things: results and obedience. The office functioned around him like a well-oiled machine. Employees hurried through corridors, their heads down, their postures tense, their eyes flicking toward him with the wary awareness of prey sensing a predator nearby. Conversations stilled when he entered a room. Laughter died on lips. Stanton enjoyed that. It was not fear exactly. Fear was too crude, too obvious. It was something more refined, an unspoken acknowledgement of his power, a collective understanding that he was not to be questioned. He had cultivated this aura over years, shaping his environment the way a sculptor carved marble. The executives beneath him had long since learned that he had no tolerance for excuses. Missed deadlines were met with a glance that could freeze blood. Hesitation in meetings was met with silence more terrifying than any reprimand. He did not shout. He did not berate. He simply looked at people the way one might inspect a faulty piece of machinery, and that alone was enough to send them scrambling to fix whatever mistake had caught his attention. There was something intoxicating about that kind of control. He had never been a man who saw others as equals. People were tools, some sharp, some dull, some in need of replacement. He kept those who were useful close and discarded those who failed to meet his expectations. It was how he had risen, how he had maintained his position. And yet, there was always something missing. Power, he had learned, required an audience. It was not enough to hold authority. It had to be seen. It had to be felt. What was the point of standing at the top if there was no one below to remind him how high he had climbed? That was why he enjoyed moments of public humiliation. Not loud, crude displays. That was for lesser men, for those who lacked refinement. No, his methods were subtler. A passive-aggressive remark in a meeting that left an ambitious young executive stammering for words. A carefully timed sigh when an assistant fumbled a document, ensuring they spent the rest of the day drowning in self-doubt. A simple, pointed pause before responding to an idea, making its presenter question whether they had spoken out of turn. It was an art. And Stanton was an artist. He had not noticed the new cleaning woman at first. Why would he? She was one of many, another shadow in the periphery of his vision, moving silently between desks, erasing the messes left behind by those who actually mattered. She was, as far as he was concerned, nothing. But then, he had seen her, noticed her, not because she sought attention, quite the opposite. She moved through the office with a kind of quiet efficiency that should have made her forgettable, and yet there was something about her, something that unsettled him. It wasn't her appearance. She was unremarkable, dressed like every other member of the janitorial staff, her uniform neat but modest. It wasn't her posture. She carried herself with the same unassuming demeanor as the others. And yet, there was something about her presence that irritated him. She was too composed, too still, too aware. He watched her from a distance, noting the way she never hesitated in her movements, the way she seemed to glide through the space without effort, without seeking approval or acknowledgement. She never rushed, never fumbled, never showed the slightest sign of discomfort in a room full of people who would never see her as anything more than a cleaning woman. There was no fear in her. That, he realized, was what bothered him. It was not arrogance. She did not carry herself like someone trying to prove a point, but she also did not shrink the way the others did. She did not glance away when someone passed too close, did not move with the hunched resignation of someone who had spent years being overlooked. She was simply there. And that was unacceptable. It was a matter of principle. There was a natural order to things. Stanton was at the top, and below him, in descending layers, were those who answered to him: the executives, the managers, the assistants, the receptionists, the interns. And then, far below, the people like her. She should have known her place. If she did not, he would remind her. Not out of malice. No, that was too crude. This was not personal. It was simply how things worked. Power had to be seen. And she was about to learn that lesson. The day unfolded like any other. The rhythm of the office was as predictable as the turning of a clock's gears. Emails sent, phone calls answered, meetings held in conference rooms with glass walls that offered the illusion of transparency while guarding secrets within. Employees moved through the space with the practiced efficiency of those who had learned to navigate a world where power was wielded not with shouts, but with silence, not with commands, but with glances. Victoria was there, as she had been every day since her arrival. She moved through the office unseen, her presence noted only in the absence of dust on desks, the emptied trash bins, the floors wiped to a spotless sheen. She worked without drawing attention, yet she saw everything. She saw the way conversations shifted when certain people entered the room, the way voices softened when Stanton passed, the way the weight of unspoken expectations settled over every interaction. She understood the rules of this place, and she understood the man who had set them. Richard Stanton had spent years ensuring that no one in his presence ever forgot their place. He had built a kingdom in which every individual was a piece on a board, positioned according to his design. He moved them when it pleased him, removed them when they no longer served their purpose. And like any ruler, he demanded acknowledgement, not through praise, not through admiration, but through submission. That was what he wanted now. It began as a moment so unremarkable that it should have passed unnoticed, as many things in the office did. Stanton was walking through the open floor, speaking in low, measured tones to one of his senior executives, his pace unhurried but deliberate, his presence a reminder that he was always watching. Employees straightened in their chairs as he passed. Some pretended to be deeply engaged in their work. Others offered him brief nods, careful not to overstep the boundary between respect and intrusion. Victoria was wiping down a table in the common area when he saw her. A pause, barely perceptible, but there. A flicker of something, annoyance, amusement. a passing thought that took shape before it could be dismissed. He stopped. The executive beside him fell silent. The surrounding employees glanced up, unsure of what had drawn their leader's attention, but aware that whatever happened next would demand their careful observation. Stanton's eyes moved over Victoria with the detached scrutiny of someone assessing an object rather than a person. "She missed a spot," he said. The words were spoken in the same tone he might have used to comment on the weather. Idle, absent of emotion, yet deliberately placed. Victoria did not pause in her work. If she heard him, she gave no indication. The executive beside him let out a quick, uncertain chuckle, unsure if Stanton was joking or if laughter would be seen as an overstep. Others around them hesitated, their gazes flicking between the cleaning woman and the man who had addressed her. Stanton took a step closer. "Clean my shoes," he said. There was no kindness in his voice, but there was no aggression either, just expectation. Just the quiet weight of authority that made refusal unthinkable. The silence that followed was thick, stretching through the office in a way that made the air itself feel heavier. Conversations faltered. Fingers hovered over keyboards, unmoving. The hum of the office machinery continued, but the human element had stilled, every mind fixed on the tableau unfolding before them. Someone shifted in their chair. A pen dropped onto a desk. The smallest, most ordinary sounds suddenly magnified. Victoria straightened. She turned slowly to face him, and for a moment, just a moment, something unfamiliar passed between them. It was not defiance. It was not shock, nor anger, nor even resignation. It was something deeper, something unsettling in its quiet intensity. Stanton felt it before he understood it. Then it was gone, vanished beneath the careful blankness of her face. She bent down. The moment broke. A murmur of discomfort rippled through the space, too faint to be called protest, but too tangible to be ignored. Some looked away, their gazes darting back to their screens. Others watched, frozen, torn between the instinct to pretend nothing was happening and the undeniable urge to see how it would end. Victoria knelt, her movements unhurried, her expression unreadable. She took the small brush from her cleaning cart, adjusted her position, and began to work. A hush fell over the room. The brush moved across the polished leather of his shoes in slow, methodical strokes. There was no hesitancy in her actions, no fumbling, no sign of anger or submission. She simply did what was asked of her, each movement precise, each stroke deliberate. And that, Stanton realized, was wrong. She was obeying him. But she was not humiliated. The realization came like a slow, creeping discomfort, like a stone in a shoe that at first goes unnoticed but becomes unbearable with every step. He had expected something else, a trembling hesitation, a glance toward the others seeking an escape, a moment of visible shame that would solidify his place above her, above all of them. But there was nothing. She was calm, too calm. The office held its breath, waiting. Victoria continued. The brush moved in measured strokes, gathering the faintest traces of dust, polishing away the last speck of imperfection. It was the kind of meticulous work that made it impossible to dismiss her as careless or unworthy, the kind that left no room for criticism, no space for condescension. And when it was done, she placed the brush back into the cart, wiped her hands on the towel at her waist, and rose to her feet. The silence deepened. Stanton looked at her, at the woman who had done exactly as he commanded, and yet somehow impossibly taken something from him in return. He did not know what it was. Not yet. But he would. The office remained suspended in silence. It was a rare thing in a space like this where movement was constant, where the hum of productivity never truly ceased. Yet now, the usual rhythm of work had been disrupted, not by chaos, not by raised voices or broken tempers, but by something far more unsettling: stillness. Victoria stood, her hands resting lightly at her sides, her face unreadable. Around her, the weight of unspoken words filled the room. Employees shifted in their chairs, their gazes flickering toward her, toward Stanton, toward one another, searching for some indication of how they were meant to react. Stanton had expected this moment to be one of quiet satisfaction. He had envisioned a different ending, the slow, inevitable collapse of dignity, the way submission curled the shoulders inward, how defeat settled into the lines of the face. He had seen it before, time and time again, and had come to expect it as a law of nature. But Victoria had given him none of that. She had knelt. She had done as he asked. And yet, as she rose, there was no trace of humiliation in her posture, no trace of shame in her gaze. Her face remained calm, composed, without the flicker of resentment or obedience he had anticipated. It was wrong. Not because she had disobeyed him, she had not, but because she had obeyed him in a way that robbed him of what he had sought. He had not asked her to clean his shoes for the sake of cleanliness. It had never been about the dust on his polished leather. It had been about reminding her, reminding everyone of where they stood. And yet, somehow she remained exactly where she had always been. She had bent, but she had not bowed. The brushstroke of her movements had not painted her as small or powerless. Instead, they had revealed something else, something he could not yet name but could feel, pressing against the edges of his understanding. A shift, an imbalance. Something had slipped, not in the room, but within himself. He was aware of the eyes on him now, his employees, his subordinates, all waiting for him to break the silence, to punctuate the moment with his authority to reestablish the natural order that had inexplicably begun to fray. But, for the first time in years, Stanton hesitated. The hesitation was imperceptible to most, a mere fraction of a second where his carefully composed expression did not change. Yet, within it, something fundamental cracked. He looked at Victoria, expecting to find something in her gaze. A flicker of triumph, perhaps, or even the faintest smirk of defiance. He found neither. She simply looked at him, her eyes dark and steady, as if measuring something he could not see. The silence stretched too long. Someone cleared their throat, a small, nervous sound that broke the stillness like a pebble dropped into deep water. Around the room, people shifted, turning back to their screens, their papers, their tasks, not because they had lost interest, but because they did not know what else to do. The moment passed, but it did not dissolve. It hung there, a lingering presence, like the scent of something burnt that would not quite fade. Victoria did not speak. She did not need to. She simply turned, her movements as steady as they had been before, and pushed her cart away from the center of the room, away from Stanton, away from the weight of so many watching eyes. She did not hurry. She did not retreat. She simply left. And in her absence, Stanton felt something rare and unfamiliar begin to form within him. Doubt. It was an absurd feeling. He was Richard Stanton. He did not second-guess himself. He did not linger on moments that should have already passed. He did not allow thoughts to fester where they did not belong. And yet, for the remainder of the day, he found himself thinking of her. It was not obsession. It was not even curiosity. It was something simpler, something more frustrating. It was the realization that he had attempted to impose a lesson, and somehow it had not taken. He had not won, and he did not understand why. The office returned to its normal rhythm. Conversations resumed, meetings continued, emails were sent, deadlines were met. But beneath it all, a subtle shift had occurred, a quiet ripple spreading through the air, unspoken but undeniable. By the time Stanton left for the evening, stepping into the cool, controlled luxury of his private car, he was no closer to an answer than he had been when the moment began. But something in him knew. The moment was not over. Not yet. The evening passed in fragments. Richard Stanton did not remember the details of his drive home, only the vague sensation of movement, the muted hum of the city beyond the tinted windows of his car, the soft glow of street lights slipping past in a rhythm that should have been soothing. But his mind refused to quiet. He tried to dismiss it. It was a small thing, a single moment in an otherwise unremarkable day, a trivial encounter with a woman who did not matter. And yet, as he walked into his apartment, a sleek, meticulously designed space in the heart of the city, he found himself replaying it. The quiet way she had obeyed him, the absence of humiliation, the stillness in her eyes. He had seen many forms of submission in his life. The nervous eagerness of subordinates desperate for approval, the silent compliance of those who feared him, the reluctant acquiescence of people who knew they had no choice. He knew them all, understood them as intimately as a sculptor understood the weight of his chisel against stone. But Victoria's response had been different. Not defiance, not obedience. Something else. Something he could not define. He poured himself a drink, ignoring the tension that had settled between his shoulders, the way his thoughts continued circling the moment like a predator that had lost sight of its prey. It was irrational, this fixation. He was a man who thrived on control, who dictated the terms of every exchange. The fact that he was still thinking about her meant, in some way, that he had lost control. And that was unacceptable. By morning, he convinced himself it was over. He arrived at the office with the same quiet authority that had carried him through every day of his career. He greeted no one as he walked in, expecting the usual hush of reverence to fall over the room as it always did. But something was different. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but he felt it. A hesitation in the way people responded, a shift in the energy of the space, as though an unspoken change had settled into the air overnight. It was absurd. Nothing had changed. And yet, as he moved through the office, he sensed something beneath the surface. The way conversations paused just a second too long when he passed. The way glances flickered toward him and then away, not with fear, but with something else. Awareness. The realization struck him with the force of something he did not want to acknowledge. They had seen. The employees who had watched Victoria kneel, who had witnessed the exchange unfold. They had seen what he had failed to recognize in the moment. It had not been an act of submission. It had been an act of control. She had taken what should have been his victory and turned it into something else. She had done what he asked, and in doing so, had left him with nothing. He told himself it did not matter. Yet, as the day wore on, the sensation only grew stronger. People were not acting differently, not in any overt way, but he could feel the shift beneath their movements, in the way they spoke, in the way they looked at him. It was as if they had witnessed a crack form in the foundation of something they had always assumed to be unbreakable. And worse, he did not know how to fix it. For the first time in years, he found himself at a loss. By mid-afternoon, the weight of it had become unbearable. He left his office, moving through the corridors with the same deliberate stride as always, searching for her. Victoria. She was in one of the smaller break rooms, wiping down a counter with the same quiet precision that defined everything she did. She did not look up when he entered. He stopped in the doorway, watching her. She knew he was there. He could tell by the way her movements did not falter, by the way she carried herself with the same measured composure as before. He waited. A flicker of something ugly curled inside him, the need to say something, to reclaim the power that had somehow slipped through his fingers. But before he could speak, she turned. And then she said it. The words that shattered everything. "You're fired." The room collapsed into silence. For a moment, he did not react, did not breathe, did not understand. Then, laughter. A short, incredulous sound, half-formed before dying on his lips as the weight of her words settled into the air between them. He felt the shift before he could process it. The door behind him. Movement in the hallway. People watching. Not a joke. Not a misunderstanding. Not possible. He straightened, forcing the world back into focus, forcing control back into his spine. "You—" The word came sharp, cutting, meant to slice through whatever absurdity had just unfolded. But she was not smiling. She was not joking. And in that moment, he saw it. The truth. She was not a cleaning woman. She had never been just a cleaning woman. She had been waiting for this moment, waiting for him. And now he was the one standing at the edge of something he did not understand. And for the first time in his life, Richard Stanton felt powerless. The moment stretched, thick and heavy, as if the air itself had turned to glass, fragile and waiting to shatter. Stanton stood motionless, his body rigid, his mind scrambling to piece together what had just happened. The words still hung in the space between them, impossible and undeniable. "You're fired." Victoria had spoken them with the same calm finality she carried in all her movements, the same unshaken composure that had unsettled him from the beginning. She had not raised her voice. She had not looked for approval or fear in the eyes of those who had begun to gather in the hallway. She had simply delivered the sentence as though it were a truth that had existed long before she chose to speak it aloud. And in that moment, something shifted. Not just for Stanton, but for the office itself. The people standing behind him, the same employees who had always avoided his gaze, who had learned to navigate the labyrinth of his authority with quiet submission, were no longer looking away. They were watching. Not in fear, but in something else. Something he did not recognize. Something dangerously close to expectation. His breath came slow and deliberate as he willed himself to regain control, to seize back the moment before it slipped too far from his grasp. "This is absurd," he said at last, his voice smooth, even, commanding. "Do you have any idea who you're speaking to?" Victoria did not blink. "Yes," she said, "I do." The quiet surety in her words was like a blade, slicing through the polished certainty he had spent years perfecting. He opened his mouth, ready to dismiss this farce, to remind her of her place, to reestablish order in a world that had always bent to his will. But then she spoke again. "I am the new owner of this company." And just like that, the ground beneath him was gone. A sharp intake of breath sounded from somewhere in the hallway. Someone whispered something, low, astonished, quickly hushed. Stanton's mind reeled, rejecting the very possibility of it. It was an insult to logic, an offense to reason. "No," he said, stepping forward, his voice laced with growing anger. "That's not possible." Victoria tilted her head slightly, observing him with that same measured patience, as though watching the inevitable unfold. "It is," she said simply. The room around him felt suddenly too small, the walls closing in, the murmurs growing louder behind him. The certainty in her voice, the weight of it, he knew, even before she spoke again, that she was not lying. "I acquired controlling shares last month," she continued. "The final transactions were completed yesterday." She said it without pride, without satisfaction, as if this were not a moment of triumph, but merely the next step in an inevitable course of events. Stanton's pulse thundered in his ears. His entire body went still, the way an animal freezes when it senses a threat it does not yet understand. This was not real. This was not happening. He had spent years building this empire, years crafting its foundation, molding its people, ensuring that nothing could ever loosen his grip. And yet, in the span of a few words, it had been taken from him. He fought to find his bearings, to claw back the control that had so suddenly been ripped away. His hands curled into fists at his sides, his voice dropping to something colder, more dangerous. "If this is some kind of joke—" "It's not," Victoria interrupted, her tone unshaken, unbothered by his rising anger. "The paperwork is final. You are no longer in control here." A wave of movement behind him. People shifting, whispering. He could feel the weight of their attention pressing against him, not in the usual quiet fear, but in something else. Anticipation, and something deeper. Relief. The realization was like a blow to the chest. He turned slightly, catching a glimpse of the faces in the hallway. Some were still frozen in shock, but others had begun to look at him differently. For the first time, there was no deference in their expressions, no fear, only the quiet, dawning awareness that the power he had wielded so effortlessly over them had just slipped from his grasp. Victoria watched him, waiting. She was giving him a choice. Leave with dignity, or fight a battle he had already lost. The rage inside him twisted, coiling tight around his pride. His entire being screamed at him to retaliate, to find a way to dismantle whatever illusion of power she had constructed. But there was no illusion. She had already won. He had nothing left to stand on. His breath came sharp and controlled, his gaze burning into hers. He wanted to find something there. Mockery, cruelty, the satisfaction of victory. But there was none of that. Only patience. Only certainty. As if she had known, from the very beginning, that this moment would come. And that terrified him more than anything. Slowly, deliberately, he straightened his cuffs, adjusting them as though preparing to walk into an important meeting. His voice, when he spoke, was calm. "I'll be speaking with my lawyers." Victoria gave a small nod, the kind given to a man who had already lost but refused to acknowledge it. "Of course," she said. "Take whatever time you need." He lingered a second longer, unwilling to let go, unwilling to turn away from the empire that had once been his. But there was nothing left for him here. With slow, measured steps, he turned, walking past the gathered employees, past the ones who had once feared him, past the ones who no longer did. And as he walked away, a sound rose behind him. Soft at first, then louder. Applause. Stanton did not look back. He could not, because for the first time in his life he was no longer the most powerful man in the room. Victoria stood motionless in the center of the room as the sound of Stanton's retreating footsteps faded down the corridor. The applause that had erupted in his wake had not been thunderous, not wild or exuberant, but steady, growing in confidence like the first tentative breath after years of suffocation. It had not been for her. not entirely. It had been for themselves. For the quiet victory of seeing a tyrant fall. For the proof that things could change. She did not bask in it. She did not acknowledge it beyond the faintest nod, the way one might acknowledge an inevitable shift in the weather. Instead, she turned back toward the room, her gaze sweeping over the people who had worked beneath Stanton's shadow for years. Some still stared at her with open disbelief, as if their minds had yet to catch up with what had just occurred. Others looked away quickly when she met their eyes, uncertain of what this change would mean, wary of what was to come. And then there were those who held her gaze, something quiet but strong settling into their expressions, not expectation, not hope, recognition. They saw her now, not as the woman who had polished their desks in silence, who had moved unseen through their hallways, not as an invisible cog in the machine. They saw her for what she had always been, the one who had been watching, the one who had waited, the one who had changed everything. She let the weight of the moment settle, not rushing to fill the silence with reassurances or promises. That was what Stanton would have done. He would have spoken to control the narrative, to shape perception before anyone else had the chance. But she had no interest in performing power. She had never needed to. Instead, she simply said, "There will be a meeting at noon." The words were not a command, not a proclamation, but a simple statement of fact. They would come because they wanted to, because they needed to understand what this shift meant. Because, for the first time in years, the future of this company was no longer dictated by fear. She turned and walked away, her footsteps steady, her path unimpeded. No one blocked her way. No one tried to stop her. Because she was no longer just a presence in the office. She was the office. Victoria entered the executive suite, the space that had belonged to Stanton for over a decade. It was a fortress of glass and steel, built to impress, designed to dominate. The air still carried the sharp scent of leather and polished wood, the traces of a man who had ruled from behind this desk like a king surveying his kingdom. She let her fingers trail lightly across the polished surface of the desk, feeling the cold smoothness beneath her touch. A symbol of power, of authority, a throne in its own right. And yet, as she stood there, she felt none of the weight that Stanton must have carried. Perhaps because her power had never come from a desk, from a title, from the hushed whispers of those too afraid to question her. Her power had come from patience, from understanding, from knowing when to move and when to wait. She turned away from the desk, stepping toward the windows that stretched from floor to ceiling, revealing the sprawling city below. From this height, the world seemed distant, abstract, a collection of lives reduced to movement, to patterns, to something almost theoretical. It would be easy to rule from here, to watch from above, to dictate and control. But she had no intention of making the same mistake as her predecessor. She would not be Stanton. She would not lead through fear. There was work to be done. At exactly noon, she entered the conference room. They were already waiting. Not just the executives, the department heads, the ones who had sat at Stanton's right hand for years, benefiting from his rule while keeping their own hands clean. No, there were others too. The employees who had watched from the shadows, the ones who had whispered in break rooms, the ones who had endured. She had not summoned them. They had come of their own accord. Victoria took a seat at the head of the table. For the first time in years, the chair did not belong to Stanton. It belonged to her. The room was silent, expectant. Some watched her with careful calculation, others with curiosity, a few with open wariness. She let them wait. Then, finally, she spoke. This company is going to change. She did not raise her voice, did not infuse her words with false promises or empty reassurances. No one interrupted. They were listening. Really listening. And that was the difference. For the first time, the office was not a place of silence born from fear. It was a place where voices would be heard, and that, more than anything, was power. The meeting stretched on into the afternoon, not because of delays or inefficiency, but because for the first time in years people were speaking. Voices that had once been silenced by fear found space to exist. Employees who had grown used to deferring, to accepting the status quo, now hesitated before speaking, then pushed past their hesitation. Some were cautious, measuring their words, unsure if this new order would truly be different. Others spoke with the sharpness of long-held grievances, unable or unwilling to disguise the weight of their experiences. Victoria listened. She did not interrupt, did not rush to correct or control. She did not wield authority like a weapon, did not use silence as a means of intimidation. She simply listened, absorbing the words, the emotions behind them, the unspoken truths that had lingered in the walls of this company for far too long. There was anger, frustration, disbelief. There was skepticism of her motives, of whether this change was real or just another illusion. She did not blame them for their doubt. She had spent too long watching this place from the outside, understanding its mechanics, to expect blind trust. It would take time. She had time. By the end of the meeting, something had shifted. It was not yet trust, not yet acceptance, but something close, a willingness to wait and see. That was enough. She left the conference room knowing that the hardest work was still ahead. The dismantling of an old order was never as difficult as the creation of something new. It was easy to remove a tyrant. It was harder to build a foundation strong enough that no one like him could ever rise again. She stepped into her office, the one that had belonged to Stanton, and felt none of the weight he had carried. Power had never been her ambition. She had never wanted to sit at the head of the table simply to be seen. But she understood now that power, in the right hands, could be something else entirely. Not a throne, not a weapon, a responsibility. She crossed the room, stopping before the wide glass window that overlooked the city. Below, the world moved as it always had. Cars threading through streets, people moving in endless currents, unaware of the small revolution that had taken place in an office high above them. For Stanton, this view had been a symbol of his dominion. He had stood here, watching, believing himself untouchable. She saw it differently. She saw the people, the lives beyond the numbers, beyond the walls of this company. She thought of the ones who worked here, who had spent years under the shadow of a man who had built his empire on fear. She thought of what it meant to truly change something, not just for now, but for the future. She had won, but victory meant nothing if it was not used wisely. A quiet knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. She turned to see one of the employees, an older woman, someone who had been with the company for years, who had seen everything that had happened under Stanton's rule. She hesitated in the doorway, as if unsure whether she truly belonged here. Victoria nodded, an unspoken invitation. The woman stepped inside, her hands clasped tightly together. She hesitated, then said, I just wanted to say thank you." Victoria held her gaze, offering the woman the space to say what she needed to. "For years, we thought nothing would ever change, that men like him would always win." The woman's voice was quiet but steady. "I don't know what happens next. I don't know if this place can ever be different. But I know that today Today was the first time in a long time that people felt like they mattered. Victoria nodded. She did not offer empty reassurances. She did not make promises she could not keep. She simply said, "Then we start from there." The woman smiled, small, tentative, but real. Victoria watched as she left the office, the door clicking shut behind her. She turned back to the window, the city stretched wide beneath her. Change had begun, and this time it would last. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss what's next. Watch more videos to keep exploring the story and share this one with others who might find it interesting.